Oh, wow. Okay, we are gonna get going here. Let's see. I didn't get myself an outline. So today we're gonna spend some time just talking about slavery in America. I thought this is important for a few reasons that we'll get to in a moment. So I know this isn't quite going to be about critical theory today, but I think those who are critical theorists, this because of our history of slavery, it's one of the reasons. And so I think it's important to understand what this is. So we're going to spend some time there today. Let me pray, and then I want to review quick and do a quick preview, and then we'll jump in. Father, I do praise you for your church and the gathering of her. Praise you that your Son is our head. He's Lord over us and all your body, not only here, but worldwide for all time. We praise him. God, help our minds and hearts to be settled on him. Give us an attentiveness. Feed us, instruct us now, oh God, help us. You might be glorified as your body is built up. And so, God, please help us now. Help us to understand more of our past as a nation and why this godless theory might be attractive. And so then help us to be prepared to give an answer. And so, God, please help us now. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so again, quick history. We went last week into the history of critical theory, which started with Marx. So this guy again, a German who then spent a lot of time in London, over to the Frankfurt School. If you remember, Marx's theory was economics and really setting the oppressed against the oppressor, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the owners against the workers. The Frankfurt School then took his idea or his underlying theory and applied it to culture, applied it to all institutions. And then this guy, Gramsci, the civilized world has been thoroughly saturated with Christianity for 2,000 years. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot be overthrown until those roots are cut. But to cut those roots, to change culture, a long march of the institutions is necessary. And so that's what we've been seeing going on in the West. The Frankfurt School, as you know, immigrated into the U.S., Columbia universities, and really began their work through the universities. Antonio Gramsci, I found out, I'm reading a book on Stalin. He was a part of a group led by Benito Mussolini, which would be the Italian dictator. So he was a part of that back then too. Anyways, so core tenets of critical theory. Again, group identity. You all maybe remember this. The group that dominates over all these other groups, and so it's which group you're a part of that is the most important. Liberation, it seeks to free the oppressed from oppression by waking us up to the systematic oppression within our culture. Moral authority, so those who are oppressed have only the right to speak because they alone have kind of the insight into what's really going on, where those are part of oppressor groups are just blind to it because we've been swimming in this oppression and we're blind to the ways that we oppress others. And then it's a zero-sum game. You can't, if I have power, it's because I've taken it from those oppressed. So there's only one pie, and the more you have, the less others have. And the method then is over here. It starts with the false consciousness, which we've just talked about. So what needs to happen is you need to raise consciousness of the oppression. You need to get woke. And then we need to learn to see all of life through this lens. So that's where we've been. I don't remember why I have that in there. So why do we want to talk about a history of slavery in America? Well, critical theory although it's operative in all of our culture, is mostly seen in the area of race, which is where we see it all over the place today. So you have critical race theory. So this is critical theory applied to race. Critical theory can, as we've talked about before, be applied to just about any area of culture. But one of the main places applied to is race. So critical race theory. And in the book Engaging Critical Theory in the Social Justice Movement, or that's actually a class or a handout. The reason the above is so appealing is because slavery was an integral part of our nation's informal beginnings. And so critical race theory or critical theory seeks to address that. But there's false understandings on both sides. How many of you heard of the 1619 Project? Is that something you're aware of? So the 1619 Project seeks to find the beginnings of our nation, not in our war for freedom from England, but in the date when the first slaves arrived in America. So their tenet is that America was founded on racism and slavery. That's the core of it, which is wrong. There's a huge project launched by the New York Times that's been widely rebuffed and discredited, but it is what's actually being taught. I have several articles up here of it being taught in schools already. It just came out not even a year ago. But then on our side, I think we sometimes might get the idea that slavery wasn't really that bad or something. Or maybe we just don't have much of a depth of understanding on the issues of slavery. And so we can sometimes be callous to this. And so I want to spend some time, for the sake of our understanding, for the sake of sympathy, on slavery. What I want to do is two things. I want to walk through some important dates in the history of slavery in America. And then I want to take, I've referenced these two fellas, Frederick Douglass and Gustavus Vassa, two slaves in America. He was earlier than him, and just to give us some understanding of what it was more like. So let's start with some important dates. So 1619 is typically the date that is marked as when the first slaves arrived. So there's notes in journals, 20 odd Negroes arrived in Virginia, bought for victual. Now, that isn't actually the date that the first slaves arrived in the Americas. Prior to this time, more than 500,000 Africans had crossed the Atlantic against their will, aided and abetted Europeans in their endeavors, provided expertise, guidance in the range of enterprises, suffered, died, and most importantly, endured. So that was written in response to the 1619 Project, which is founded on the premise that the slaves first arrived in 1619. So just showing the historical inaccuracy of the 1619 Project. So more than 500,000 slaves had already arrived by that time. And in 1619, those first 20 weren't actually slaves. They were indentured servants. But in the 1500s, African slaves were already being brought to the New World. And the Dominican Republic was the New World's first slave port. And so slaves had been coming for some time already. In 1662, the colony of Virginia passed a law decreeing that children will be slaves or free depending on what the mother was. So if your mother was a slave and you were born of her, no matter what your father, you were then a slave for life. This is getting to the injustice of this already. Now, in Scripture, there is a lot of laws legislating slavery. And one of the laws legislating slavery was anyone who is caught stealing men or selling men or women who were stolen was to suffer the death penalty. And so our kind of slavery in America was predicated on kidnapping and selling stolen men and women. And so the roots of our kind of slavery in America were unjust from the beginning. It wasn't lawful. Now, later on, as we'll get into the history of slavery in America, what do you do, though, when you have generations of men and women who've already been enslaved? And if you read any actual history of slavery in America, one of the things that many Southern slave owners wrestled with, who had inherited their fathers or grandfathers or several generations of slaves, is how much they didn't want to be slave owners, but what were they to do? Just free them, which would have been helpful to them at all. And that's taking a rabbit trail, so we won't go there. In 1668, Pennsylvania sees its formal anti-slavery resolution passed by the Quakers. So the Quakers then become the religious ground zero for opposition to slavery, which I think we should give great thanks for. And so men like Frederick Douglass and others will find great help in joining with the Quakers to oppose slavery in the South. 1691, Virginia passes first laws forbidding marriage between whites and blacks. The southern colonies will all pass similar laws. Some northern colonies will as well, but will repeal them, and some northern states never had such laws. So Wisconsin actually never had any laws forbidding marriage between blacks and whites. Spanish Florida in 1738 would promise freedom to any runaway slaves. And interesting note is that slaves who did run away and find freedom in Florida often ended up living among the Seminoles because the Seminoles would provide them protection, which I thought was pretty cool. Before then, they were, forced to Oklahoma. 1758. The Quakers prohibit slavery among its members. So if you were a slave owner and a Quaker, you would have been disciplined out of their church, which is what should have happened. 1775, first abolition slavery in Pennsylvania. Vermont banned slavery in 1777 and gave the vote to any adult slaves, which is incredible. And so the North, as you can see, is beginning to separate from the South already. And so there's a good history here in America that these anti-slavery organizations were the first in the world, not just in the New World, the first in the world. 1787, all Northwest territories forbid slavery. And then 1790, we have a constitution ratified with a clause allowing for runaway slaves to return to their owners. And the state's delegates to the House would be determined by counting only 3/5 of its slaves. So there's a common misunderstanding there that they were saying slaves are only 3/5 human. That wasn't the point. It was a concession to the southern colonies that the number of its slaves would only count 3/5 towards figuring out how many representatives they would get to the House of Representatives. That's often misunderstood, I think. So the Underground Railroad gets going in the early 1800s. So this is, of course, past our independence. That Underground Railroad wasn't named until 1831. And kind of, I thought, a funny note, Frederick Douglass would later lament how much publicity the Underground Railroad was getting. And so he began referring to it as the Above Ground Railroad because it wasn't very secret anymore. And it was quite an organization with all these houses set up along the way and conductors conducting. It is really incredible what they did. And they would try to get to Canada, many of them, because Canada had passed legislation that any blacks reaching Canada would be completely free and protected. And so 100,000 slaves escaped to Canada. 1831, The Liberator, if you've heard of that, a newspaper started by William Lloyd Garrison, runs until 1865. My name is Liberator. I propose to hurl my shafts at freedom's deadliest foes. My task is hard, for I am charged to save man from his brother, to redeem the slaves. And so much good work. And then, of course, the Republican Party formed in 1854. So there you had the Democratic Party, and then another party, a third party. So there was a part of history in America where we weren't a two-party system, but a three-party. And the third party at that time was called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party were abolitionists, among other things. But there was a fight within the Free Soil Party, and another party was birthed, then the Republican Party, that many of the Free Soilers came to be part of. And the Republican Party was founded primarily, again, in opposition to slavery. Does anybody know where the first Republican Party meeting was held? Ripon, Wisconsin, right? Yeah. So Wisconsin has some neat role in this. In 1857, though, the Dred Scott decision denied citizenship to all slaves, ex-slaves, descendants of slaves, so that it held that the rights of the Constitution could not be applied to them. That decision pretty much guaranteed the Civil War, because it forbid constitutional rights to anybody with any slavery in its descent. It's awful. So other than Roe, this decision is thought to be, the worst decision passed by our Supreme Court. And so this is why I think anybody who knows any history of the Supreme Court, I know that we often get really, if we can just get more conservative justice in the Supreme Court, then things will go better. The Supreme Court has been largely a disappointment in the history of the United States. There's some awful decisions, and this maybe being the worst of them all. 1859, the last slave ship brings slaves to the U.S. 1861, Lincoln elected seven southern states to secede even before his inauguration. The Civil War begins. He declares all slaves free in 1863, and we know he's assassinated just days after the war's end. In 1865, slavery is finally abolished with the adding of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. We don't have time to get into it, but after the abolishment of slavery, then, in the South particularly, our history of awful racism continues, first with black code laws, which kept blacks in the South from voting, from owning guns, from serving on juries, and from owning or renting land. The black code laws then set the precedent for the Jim Crow laws, which in 1896 the Supreme Court affirmed in separate but equal, which was undone in 1964. So you had more than half a century with these awful laws in place, but in 1964, Civil Rights Acts, 1965 Voting Rights Acts undid these awful racist laws. We lived in North Carolina for a time when I was attending seminary. We lived, 45 minutes north of Charlotte in Taylorsville County. And in Taylorsville County, one of the little towns of the east of it, Hiddenite, North Carolina, you could still see signs on the buildings of blacks and whites restrooms and so on. No, not current, but still there. Yeah. No. So it should be obvious that 346 years of slavery, exclusion from constitutional rights, black code laws, Jim Crow will severely impede, if not outright destroy, a people. Descendants of slaves and others who were systematically brutalized and disenfranchised naturally feel the residual effects of this oppression. These effects appear in a number of categories where African Americans have experienced significant deficits, including civic support relationships, educational attainment opportunities, and vocational attainment opportunities, inherited wealth and resources. I wanted to quote from Neil Shenvi. He is probably, I think, the most accessible as far as finding information on critical theory if you want to do some more research yourself. He's got a website with tons of resources. He's a Christian, very conservative. He does a lot of apologetic work, speaking all over. He has a whole section of resources on critical theory if you'd like to check it out. But critical theory, it is a response to this. It's a false response, but it's a response to something that happened that's really awful and wicked in our country. Okay, so let's spend some time just looking at two accounts. So this is Olaudah Equiano, born in 1745, died in 1792. This is one of the first accounts of slavery in the Americas. He really wasn't ever in our country. I mean, he lived before our country was a country, but he spent most of his time in the Caribbean and in England. But he was born in 1745. I would encourage you to get this and read it. If you'd like to borrow mine, I don't think I'll need it, but please do. It is really powerful. And also, I think it's helpful to read these kind of things because you can just have such a false understanding of what was going on, either for it's worse than it was or better than it was. And this is his autobiography, which itself is incredible. And he writes well, very understandable. But born in 1745 in what is known as Nigeria, southern Nigeria, he, along with his sister, was kidnapped by a rival tribe in 1956 or 1756. Why did I put 19? 1756. So, he is one of the things you'll find out. I don't know the numbers, but typically blacks who ended up enslaved in the West were first kidnapped by other tribes, and then he actually spent about his first year being sold and resold within Africa, all over the place. Over the next 6 months, he did end up once being sold and bumped into his sister again, but shortly they were separated again, and then he ended up on the coast where he was transported along with 244 other enslaved Africans bound for Barbados, 1757. The account of the Middle Passage, being on a slave ship, is probably the most powerful thing about this book. It's just simply awful what he endured. He ended up in Virginia just for a very short time, where he was sold to Michael Pascal, lieutenant in the Royal Navy. He served as aboard ship as his valet, and then served with him during the 7 Years' War. And so his account of being on that ship and learning sailing, but also his job was to run the gunpowder to the cannons, and several just harrowing battles that he was a part of. It was, a page turner. Once you get going on this book, I couldn't put it down. He did learn seamanship, and then was sent to his master at the time. Loved him, had a very good relationship, and so he ended up with his master's sister-in-law to attend school. But during his 6 years with her, he did spend much of his time at sea, both in commerce and in war. But he did learn to read and to write, and then would continue his education after that. In 1962, he was surprisingly sold. He had a bit of a falling out, or 1762. A man who takes him to the West Indies, where he's sold to a wealthy merchant, Robert King, who again saw the great worth of this man, and he was a hard worker, very intelligent. He becomes invaluable to this king. So he's a deckhand, a valet, a barber. He learns to cut hair and make some money doing that. But as he is working for this man in shipping, he begins to have kind of a side hustle himself, where wherever he's selling, would buy whatever he thinks would sell well, and then when he ships to another place, he would sell it, and he made a ton of money so that he was able to purchase his freedom after just 3 years. Robert King didn't want to give him his freedom, even though he had promised it, because he was so valuable to him, but pressure was put on him enough where he was able to purchase his own freedom. So he would spend the next 20 years of his life traveling the world. I mean, all over the place, working on the sea, England, the Arctic, India. The trip to the Arctic was incredible. They actually got frozen in the Arctic and thought they would perish, and ended up surviving. The guy's life is incredible. In 1783, he began involved with abolition in England, lecturing, wrote his memoir in 1789, and so that's one of the earliest published slave narratives. I think there's only one earlier, but none as interesting. He married in 1792 to Susanna Cullen, so he married an English woman. Had 2 daughters and died in 1797. And so again, I encourage you to check it out. And his time in slavery was brutal. The things that he suffered, just awful how he was treated. So that's his life. Next, we have Frederick Douglass, who you might be more familiar with. I found this. I bought it this past week. This is a volume. He wrote 3 autobiographies, and this has all 3 of them contained in it. And I've only read one of them, so I'm looking forward to reading the rest of them. So Frederick Douglass, so he came later. He was born in 1818 to a slave woman. He really didn't know his mom much at all, visited her with her a few times, but he was raised by his grandma for a bit, and the account of him being taken from his grandma is awful. He was, I think, 6, and once the boys got to a certain age, they would often be separated, and his grandma walks him from where they were living to the master's main plantation, and he doesn't know why, and then just leaves him, just drops him and leaves him. So he's sent to live with his master. I can't remember his master's name, and he's there for a few years when he's sent to live with his master's son-in-law, Hugh Auld, and he was basically a playmate for their son for a number of years. And in 1826, the main master died. And when the master died, the slaves were basically, it's like picking a kickball game of who they ended up with. So husbands and wives, children separated. So he was actually given to the master's other son-in-law, Thomas, who allowed him to remain with Hugh. Hugh's wife began to teach Douglass to read. He was a very intelligent guy, and the way he writes, most consider him one of the best English authors in the history of the English language to come from it. But when Hugh learned that his wife was teaching Douglass to read, it really began a family fight. He was forbidden to be taught anymore. The wife, who was very warm to him, became very cold to him. And he was sent back then to Thomas in 1833. And you'll see this in the slaves. They just get bounced all over the place. He goes into a lot of detail about their living conditions and food and the amount of work they were required to do and so on. Both Thomas and Hugh were poor masters. Douglass was a man of incredible backbone. We'll get into that in a moment, but he was not easily bent. And so Thomas really didn't know what to do with him, so he sent him to a slave breaker. So this man was a vicious man. So Douglass is here just a young man yet. And this slave breaker just abuses him. And the first account, when Douglass gets there, he's a teen. He, prior to this time, had just lived in the master's house, mainly taking care of the master's son. So he has no experience in the fields at all. And this slave breaker hitches a cart up to 2 ox that hadn't been broken and forced him to take them. Of course, the ox go running off crazy, and then he just gets beaten over and over and over again for not controlling them. After 6 months with the slave breaker, Douglass stands up to him and basically challenges him to a fight. And from that moment forward, the slave breaker would never touch him again. And Douglass risked greatly. I mean, he could have been killed for that. He's rented out, as sometimes slaves are, to another master, William Freeland, where he begins to plot his escape with 3 slaves. One of the slaves turns them in. Douglass was the ringleader of the escape plan. So he's jailed in 1836 before being sent back to Thomas. Thomas then Douglas works an arrangement with Thomas because of his great value and intelligence and work ethic, where he wants to learn a trade. He wants to learn something because he's already thinking ahead for his freedom. And so Thomas rents him out, and he is apprentice learning the caulking trade in shipbuilding. One of the most awful accounts is because he's such a good worker, the other slave apprentices just about beat him to death one day in front of everybody. None of them is arrested. None of them is charged with anything. In 1838, he escaped to New York, marries Anna Murray, with whom he has 5 children. He begins almost immediately anti-slavery work, still employed working on ships. Even in the North, which is surprising to me, how much racial injustice he experienced. There's an account of him riding on a train that was pretty awful. He is free, but just because he escaped, he is still able to be captured and sent back. And so when he wrote his first autobiography and it was published, he did so at great risk of being recaptured, because his slave owner Thomas is still alive and does vow to recapture him. So he ends up going to England, partly to avoid capture and partly to spread anti-slavery in England. And it's really neat. In England, unlike America, he doesn't really suffer any racial prejudice at all. In fact, finds many friends and financial backers. Really a neat thing. So America, if you read these two accounts, is very racially motivated. I mean, just a lot of prejudice, a ton of racism. Or in England, it's just not the case. And I'm sure people have written why. I don't understand the reasons why, but it is true. Thomas finally does commit to selling Frederick his freedom for 150 pounds sterling, so about $700, which an English supporter provides. And so he is able to gain his freedom, and where then he's back in America, where he works the rest of his life to abolish slavery. Founds his own newspaper and speaking all over America. He ends up going back to South Carolina and meets his former masters again and other family members. It's really an incredible life. And so he has, as I said, 3 autobiographies, the second of which I'll tell you the name of it, is the one I would recommend first if you do any research. It's called My Bondage, My Freedom. It's brief, but I would encourage that if you want to get a good picture of slavery in America and escape and so on. Really worth your time. Both of them become Christians throughout their time. His story of his conversion is really interesting. Excellent. So that's slavery, at least a brief glimpse into slavery in America. I am by no means an expert on it, but I wanted to, I have the same education most of you did, which, we were taught something of it, but I didn't remember much of it. So I wanted to, in preparation for this and just with what's going on, learn some more about it. So I've read a fair bit. So time for questions. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
There was many white slaves also, correct?
There was many white slaves also.
I've heard of that.
I don't think many would be accurate.
Okay.
There were blacks who enslaved blacks in the South, but I'm not sure about the many white slaves. Typically in the history of the world, slavery is ubiquitous, right? Slavery is in every culture and everywhere. There were white slaves who were being enslaved by Northern Africans. So if that's what you're talking about, yes. And so typically the reason that the Bible legislates slavery is because there were just reasons to be enslaved. One would be economic. If you were a part of a area that had hard economic times and you couldn't provide, you could enslave yourself in order to be provided for. That would be a just reason to become enslaved. Another would be warfare. If you were part of a conquered land, the choices were either to be executed or enslaved, and so enslavement was a more humane thing. And then related to the first would be if your husband died or big illness in the family, you could enslave yourself. And so the Bible is legislating that kind of slavery. It wasn't legislating this kind of slavery necessarily, but yes. So yes, every culture has enslaved. This is part of the fallen humanity. It's true. Yep, Dave.
But wasn't in slavery and indentured servant, because a lot of people from the old world trying to get to America would have somebody wealthy
Sure.
put up their passage to the New World, and then they would owe that family servant.
Yeah, so Dave is asking about indentured servitude versus slavery. So yes, there are whites who would kind of sell their labor in order to get to the New World and work it off, but that's not this.
Yeah, no,
Yep.
it's not.
Yeah,
It's different.
totally different thing, but yeah, both were happening, sure. Yep. Roger.
I mean, slavery is one form of, person being oppressed, but how come we're in this time right now with this movement that's going on in America with blacks? How come we're not also hearing that from the Native Americans, which we did unspeakable injustices?
Yeah.
That's just a form of oppression that we did to them.
Yeah, so Roger's asking why don't we hear as much about the Native American, the horrors that we've done?
Go to Lake to Flambeau and you'll hear it all the time.
Yeah, I don't know, Roger. That's a great question.
Because it's that happened right here from us as well. So.
Yeah,
Smaller minority, maybe?
could be smaller minority. It could be the war that happened between the whites as we began to expand west. That I don't know.
I can see a big uprising of that too, because they're another oppressed people.
Yeah, they're definitely not included, but maybe it is the numbers. I don't know.
There, and I was discriminated against because I was white.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, oppressed.
No.
Were the Irish also enslaved here in this country?
Yeah, so there were whites enslaved, and Irish are one of them. One of the most interesting things I've read is, I'm not going to think of his name, the Stanford economist, Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell has written a book, if I can think of the name of it. It's called, Thomas, I got to tell you the title because it's really a catchy title. Anyways, he makes the case, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. It's a brief book, and he makes the case in there that the kind of black ghetto culture is actually borrowed from the poor Irish who came over, who were slaves in Ireland often, or definitely economically lower and so on, and that the kind of culture that you see that is sometimes the black ghetto gangster rap is inherited from the white Irish. And so Thomas Sowell draws a very interesting conclusion of how, as much as blacks hate, that's where they got it from, their language, and he draws a historical connection there. It's really a very interesting book, that they become what they hated. Yeah.
As it relates to the Native American side, how do we see how this plays out in other countries? Meaning, America is super late to the slavery game. other, it's been around forever. Other even powers have had it long before. America's almost the last country to get involved. And then we fight the bloodiest war that we've ever fought to end it. You don't see that anywhere else. So as far as and the Indian side, throughout the rest of the world, there would be the same type of, there was slavery, now there's not. I feel only in America is there this sense of entitlement from specifically the black community that you owe us something. I just don't see that anywhere else. I mean, the rest of the world was colonized through Europeans. Where's the sense of owing them? And that's what I don't think that the reason I would expect to not see it from them is because you don't see it anywhere else. It's just one specific people group in this country that feels like they're owed something, 200 years later. How does that play out in the rest of the
Yeah. So I'm repeating the questions for the people on the live stream because they can't hear you guys. So Matt's asking, why in America is there this huge racial tension, push for reparations when this has been happening all over the world? I mean, first he's gonna say America was late to the game because we're the youngest nation in the world. So, what? This is totally my opinion. Again, I'm not that learned in it. One would be, I don't think any other country has done what America did with the Black Code laws and Jim Crow laws.
Okay.
So the racism that has been inherent in America, I think, is kind of unparalleled in that regard. But if you're asking why today there is such a, with critical theory and so on, I think it's largely due to leftist progressive policies. Again, Thomas Sowell is probably the best on this. He's got tons of videos. He basically shows historically completely accurate that until the left liberal policies, Black America was doing great. They were great. And then all of the push to see oppressed oppressor, everything we've been talking about, creates this illusion. And so why is America so racially inflamed today? I think it's mainly critical theory being driven, especially through the educational institutions. Yeah. I mean, as is objectively verifiable, there's been no better place for minorities to live in the history of the world than the West, and particularly in America. Yeah. Interesting. I think that's it. It's a false gospel when you try to solve a problem, which there is, of racism, but you do it not with looking to the God who makes all man in his image and redeems them by the blood of his son. You're going to put in a false Christ. And the false Christ then ultimately here is a centralized, all-powerful government that you look to solve every problem. And they're making it infinitely worse.
I believe in our first week you had mentioned that critical theory would be the prominent worldview.
At least a predominant alternative to a Christian worldview.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is that only in America?
No. So Matt's asking, is critical theory only America?
Sure. Then the slavery part of it would, why wouldn't, if critical theory is, because I would agree that it's not just in America, but then why do all these other places that would have had an even longer history of slavery, why isn't critical theory in their countries, coming back to do what it is here?
Is it only in America? I'm not sure I can answer that. It appears so, though.
Okay.
I think with the history you saw last week of the Frankfurt School ending up in America, especially in the American universities,
Sure.
I think it is unique.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to dive deeper into these. And so we're going to go down deep into critical theory and the next biblical response to it. So we're going to get down in the muck a bit more now.